right, excellent. So good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Yeah, not responsive at all. That's not going to work well for me because it's going to be hard for you. The way we're going to do it today is by exploring new adventures. And when I talk about new adventures, I'm not talking about kind of general things that most people are talking about. Like, I think you're smart people. If somebody asks you to improve a performance, I guess you'll find the reason. Oh, maybe you'll find it on Stack Overflow or on Google. You'll find a way to make it work. When it comes to off-canvas navigation, you'll make it work. When it comes to tables, you'll make it work. But there are some things that are really difficult to make work. And so this is the ones I'm going to talk about today. Now, my name is Vitaly. I was born in Belarus and moved to Germany. And I spent like the last 16 years of my life in Germany, now living in Lithuania. But I do understand Polish, so I totally accept questions in Polish. I co-founded the site a little while back, and still editor of most articles that come on the site. And yes, it's going to look like this, and yes, it's red, and we'll talk about it later. That's not a big deal. Now, you know, very often you come to talks like this, and you're totally disappointed because you don't get a lot of practical value. So I thought maybe I could make it a bit more interesting, so I decided to make it a game. And the game is called Responsive Adventures. And some of you might be familiar with the theme, and it's a really tough game to play. I'm going to post challenges, and these challenges are really quite advanced. So if you think that you have an idea, just raise your hand or shout. And if you do have a good idea, I'll have chocolate for you from Australia. Doesn't sound like a good deal to you? Anybody here in the room? Yeah, well, all right. Let's better play. I hope you appreciate the sound effects that went into this. All right. Now, first of all, I need to settle the foundation right. You have to tell me how dirty do we want to play. Now, the tricks I'm going to show you are kind of somewhere in the gray area between what's supposed to be best practice and what's supposed to be, well, definitely not best practice. So you have to come with a little bit of pragmatism to this talk. So who wants to take it easy today? Anybody? Who wants to go medium? Who wants to go all the way? Wow, that's now we're talking. All right, you know, it's just a video. I can't click anywhere. But it gives me an idea of what we're going to do. All right. Cool. Now, let's start. Now, there are many components that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And one of them, which is just everywhere, is, of course, typography. But there are many different ways of how you can make fluid type work. And there are some ways how you can make it maintainable long term. Let's imagine you have a problem. You have a really annoying designer, like a really annoying designer. And for them, getting things done well is really, really important. So you have to build in fluid flexible type, and you want to keep it easy to maintain long term. Now, you could say for every single component on the page, be it H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, small, caption, and all the other ones, paragraph, and so on, you're going to go ahead and define lots of media queries to define this beautiful intended responsive experience. Yes, you can make it work, but it will require a lot of effort and a lot of time. And you want to make sure that the hierarchy stays consistent across viewport. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, a modular scale. Many designers are going to operate with a modular scale. So whenever you're designing something, it's always kind of sticks to the hierarchy. So H1 is clearly different from H2, it's clearly different from H3, and so on and so forth. And this is probably what you want to achieve anyway, right? And so how can we achieve this easily? Is there a way to make it easy, like to behave it responsively? Because this is what we're after, right? This is kind of what we want to achieve, but in a very compact and maintainable way. So how would you make it work? Anybody? And we're not talking about like having dozens of breakpoints at this point. There are no breakpoints. It just all fluidly grows and expands and becomes smaller as intended. It does require a little bit of work, though. Bootstrap, no. No Bootstrap. You can make it like with a couple of properties. Yes, you can use viewport with you. As somebody said, you have to come to me later. But there are many different ways of how we can make it work. Now, first of all, we need to understand one thing. We want to be flexible. We want everything to be flexible. Every single thing has to be flexible, which means that if we're building a component, we need to make sure it scales up and down easily. So if you want anything in your interface to scale up and down beautifully, we need to do a little trick, right? In the end, we do want to have this kind of components, and then just define one little setting somewhere So if you need to make it bigger, no, it's just going to be bigger, right? Because it's a library of components. So what works, of course, is to say we're going to insert Trojan horse into our components. So on our component level, we're going to define the font size in rem unit, right? How many of you are familiar with rem units? Everybody. Well, almost everybody. So we can define the root in rem, and then everything inside of that component, every sub-modules or sub-parts of that component are going to be defined in m units. So if we just change the font size of rem on the root of the component for a specific media query at breakpoint view or breakpoint range, then it's going to scale up beautifully, right? Right? That's easy. So in the end, we can do something like this, right? We could say, we're just going to change the font size on the root for a specific breakpoint, and then it's going to grow up and down as we intend it to be. And yes, browser support for rem is great, so there is no reason not to use it. There is, of course, shiny Internet Explorer 8 not supporting it, but we're used to it at this point. We'll figure it out. So if we want to make it work, we can target specific screen width ranges and adjust type by just manipulating the font size on rem. And this is what it's going to look like. This is very easy. It's going to get a bit more difficult. We're going to define it in rems, right? H1, H2, H3, H4, and so on and so forth. And we can also do even more fancy things over there. And for our good old Internet Explorer, we're going to provide a fallback in pixels. And then we want to turn it into something a bit more manageable. So we want it to grow in a specific way or shrink in a specific way. So we're going to go ahead and media queries and do this, right? And probably turn it from pixels into rem units so it scales up beautifully. Yes, but this is too much work. Imagine doing this for every single component. That's way too much work. So if we want to achieve a really beautiful fluid typography, we need to make it a bit better by a combination of calc and viewport units. So we can use something like this, right? On HTML, font size calc 1m plus VW. VW is 1%, 1 VW is 1% of the viewport width, 1 VH is 1% of the viewport height, and then you have Vmin and Vmax, which is the minimum and the maximum between them, right? And then we kind of have this beautiful growth, right? Natural growth, fluid growth, without having to introduce any media queries, actually. That kind of works, but this is not quite what we want, because if we do this, we have an infinite growth, and we have in a small screen, the font size can be very, very small, and a large screen can be very, very huge. It doesn't give us a lot of control here. So if we wanted something very specific, to choose a font size of 16 pixels at a screen resolution of 400 pixels, and then beautifully transition to 24 pixels at a resolution of 800 pixels, we can't do it without the breakpoint. And I hate media queries. I can't stand media queries, because every single time I plug it in, it's like if-then statement. And the more if-then statements you have, the harder the maintenance is going to be. The more time it's going to take to actually adjust it long term. So as a result, this is kind of the curve we want to have, right? Now bear with me, some mathematics coming along. But we like math, right? Everybody likes mathematics, right? Yeah, say like 10 people in the room, all right? Okay, so if we look very closely at what we want to achieve, that requires some mathematical equations. So in every single design that we're building, the reason why we call those media queries or like breakpoint ranges breakpoints is because things break. And when things break, it's a continuum of experiences we have to cover. So in some areas, everything is going to be fine, but in some areas, the experience is going to suck big time. And if you look into some websites, you will see it kind of happening all the way. So you see some green areas where everything is kind of fine and okay. This is how it was intended to be. But then if you kind of go to specific areas in between, you'll find out that some things just start breaking a little bit. It's not a big deal, but it's not what we want. We want it to be working all the way, from small to big, right? Everywhere. So in some areas, again, everything will be fine. But the more breakpoints we introduce, the harder it's going to be to maintain. And we actually have to do it because, at this point here, the spacing is becoming a bit weird, right? And so we need to make it work. So what we want is not this, just infinite growth or infinite shrinking. We want this. And specifically to our type example applied, we want to have a nice, beautiful area where the things grow and shrink, but then a nice minimum and a nice maximum, where things just stop growing. Does it make sense? Now, I'm not talking about type here specifically. You can apply it to any single component. In fact, you can apply it to anything that relates to padding, sizing, width, height, border radius, whatever. You really can apply it to everything. So what you want to achieve is not this linear thing, but kind of this, right? For specific sizes, the designer has made a decision of what to do and when. But this requires us to solve a little equation. I'm not kidding, by the way, right? Which makes things a little bit difficult, because we need to think about how can we approach this. Now, there is no way you can solve it in CSS, even with calc. This is just not possible. But you can try to approximate it with polynomial regression, which is really cool. So you can think about if we need to define this line, well, we have a slope, we have a current viewport width, the y-intercept, and the resulting font size, which we want to achieve, right? X is basically our viewport, and M is how strongly the curve is going to grow, and B is the offset. Or if you want to be very specific, this is what you have to solve, which is really impossible in CSS. It really is, right? But what the hell does it mean for us? Well, all right, so we know that we're going to define our typography in rem units. That's nice. What we could do is say we can calculate for every single component a specific line that we want to be. Like, so whenever a designer actually designs something, they're kind of designing that curve, more or less, the experience. And so we can calculate the slope and the y-intercept and plug it in for every single component. Now, we need to understand that, of course, we will not do it manually all the time. But we need to understand what's happening behind the scenes. And then, probably a good idea to turn from pixels into something a bit more manageable, like rem units, right? And so what you end up here having is, for every single thing, not necessarily type alone, you can have a nice, beautiful experience growing and shrinking, right? And again, if you can anticipate it by just breaking down this entire experience into chunks. And you will be using, of course, Sass, probably, or less, or stylus in order to make it work. So if you do use it, you can use this polyfluid sizing method, which allows you to just get a map of different breakpoints at different sizes, and then plug it in, like this. And what it's going to produce is a set of media queries. I do hate media queries, but it does produce a set of media queries which define this experience, so it's always a nice, beautiful, fluid experience, right? Which is actually really, really cool. But it's really easy to maintain, because what you actually end up doing is you have to maintain this little map, and that's it. And so as a result, you end up with this, right? And more specifically, you probably also want to make sure that you can turn it on and turn it off. So you could set the font size with calc on the HTML, and then everything is becoming fluid because you define all the width in rem units. And then you can turn it off if you need to in a fixed container by just setting fixed font size. And so then you end up with this, right? And then if, like for example, for advertising or so. And if you need to turn it on after all, well, you can do it the other way around, where you say, I want to define it in a fluid container. So you define it on the root element of the container in font size, and then everything in there is going to be defined in M units, right? And then you end up with this kind of experience, which is actually really, really cool. Or you could use this little formula if you like, which is very trivial, actually, if you think about it. So if you want to grow in a specific range from one value to another, you just set a minimum font size over here. You set the difference between the maximum font size and the minimum font size. And then here you're defining the area over which you're growing. And then here defining how much area is left in order to grow. And you're kind of done. And of course, because we are lazy, by the way, sorry. There are also many interesting ways of how we can make it work outside of the scope of the font size alone. So here you can see that the layout is defined once, and it's a really beautiful fluid experience all the way. There are no breakpoints here at all, right? And of course, because we're lazy, there is a tool now that you can also use to build it easily. So it's not that hard to build it anymore. All right? Okay. So we would be probably using something like this, one of some formulas or something like this property with calc in order to make sure that things are flexible enough. So there are also some really interesting, nice features, new features that are coming up in CSS now as well. So what if you want to detect hover? It's always been a story. There are always lots of JavaScript workarounds to make it work, and it's kind of super annoying. So if you design a sophisticated hover effect, but then you encounter your website is displayed on the mobile phone, how do you make sure that the experience is still OK if hover is not available? So, or specifically, what if you want to achieve an experience like this? Have two images, a low fidelity image and a high fidelity image, right? If you don't have, if you do support hover, you want, of course, to display the actual high fidelity image on hover, but you don't want to display a low fidelity image if you don't have any hover, right? So how do you make it work? You want to kind of handle these hover-based interactions meaningfully. Now, with CSS level 4 media queries, we can detect reliably if hover is available. And more specifically, this is probably what we're going to do. We create two images, right? By default, we wrap a link around embedded low fidelity SVG. Then we set the high fidelity SVG as background on it. And we set the opacity 0% or opacity 0 on lo-fi. And then we change it to 1 on hover, but only if hover is available, right? So the way to work it is, to make it work is really easy. You can just use target specifically at media hover. And if it's supported, well, then you have your hover effect. And if not, well, then you don't have it, right? And if we look into browser support for it, you'll find out that it's actually pretty remarkable. Browser support for hover is decent with Firefox coming along on the side as well. So there is no reason not to use it. But you might say, well, OK, but I need something more. Maybe I need something like a gradient here at the bottom. So you will be probably creating it with a before-after pseudo element, right? Oops, sorry. And so what you end up doing is maybe something like this, and then you have a background linear gradient, so it kind of fades out beautifully. All right? The problem is that any content that falls underneath that shadow, in that gradient, will not be selectable or otherwise accessible for interaction. So if we don't want that pseudo element to be blocking access to the content lying underneath it, we need to make it a little bit smarter. And to make it work, the only thing we need to do, basically, is to check for pointer events and set pointer events none on that gradient, right? Because pointer events give us the ability to decide if we want to have any interaction on that element or not, right? And the pointer events are actually well supported as well. And what you might have noticed in here, you can also use at support, which is kind of in many ways a replacement for modernizer that we don't need anymore. So you can just check for specific features, native features in the browser, and if pointer events are supported, well, only then you're going to plug it in. And browser support is right there. And if you want to read a bit more about this, here's a nice article I encourage you to read. I hope everybody is awake now. And the one last thing that's also quite useful is to think really carefully about the selectors you're using and how you're using them. Because if we want to achieve this really beautiful, fluid experience in responsive design, we need to do a bit more work than just, tons of breakpoints. And this is where selectors can be extremely helpful. Now imagine you have to build a layout like this. Or like maybe let's say it this way. What if you want a tidy grid with fine and consistent line endings? Sometimes you might end up with orphans or widows on the last line, and that's not what your designer wants you to have. So you want to end up with something like this, or like this, or like this, or like this, but never having just one box in the last line. And I know what you're saying. Flexbox. Flexbox solves everything. You can just stretch the last element and call it a day. Yes, it will work, but if you have a 2,000 pixels viewport width, do you want that box to stretch all the way across 2,000 pixels? Probably not. It's not going to look great. So this is what you want, let's say, cats. So you have three kinds of display of a product. You have prominent display, level 1, not so prominent display, level 2, and everything else that doesn't fit just has to go underneath, right? Now what you want to achieve is display beautifully a really perfect grid. If you can fit in 5 images in here, you want to display exactly 10 products over there. And then everything else should go, under it. If you can display only 3, then you need to display only 6 here in 2 lines, and then everything else should go underneath. And you don't want to create tons of media queries saying, if this, do this. If it's 3, do this. If it's 5, do this. If it's 7, do this, and so on and so forth. That would be too much work, right? Can we make it better? Because this is kind of the experience you're after, right? Again, we have 3 different displays for the product. Let's say on a product page. And you don't want the experience to be broken at any given time. If I look again into this continuum of experiences, we always have this breakpoint where if the user hits that uncomfortable range, the experience is going to be really bad. And we don't want that. We want to have a really beautiful, fluid experience all the way, so it works just fine all the way. Now, if we want to make it work, we'll have to look a bit closely at how CSS quantity selectors work, or CSS selectors work in general. Quantity selector in CSS is a selector that allows styles to be applied to elements based on the number of siblings. So if I have 5 elements, I want at least 5, I want it to look like this. If I have at least 10, I want it to look like this, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is very often we need to be flexible enough, because otherwise, well, you don't know how many items your product page is going to have. Maybe it will be 5. Maybe it will be 25. Maybe it's going to be 205. You don't know, but you want it to work well, independent of how many items you have. So with quantity selectors, you can build queries based on the number of siblings. So you can say, if I have at least 5 elements, I want them to look this way. So if, let's say, here, I'm looking to all unordered list items, and if I have at least 5 items, I want them to look in a specific way. So starting from the 5th, the style changes. It really depends on the number of children. At the same time, you can also say, if I have at most 7 or 6, I want it to look this way, but if I have 7 or 8, then I want it to look different, right? Now, there is a general sibling selector, adjacent sibling selector, which separates 2 selectors and matches the second element only if it's preceded by the first and both share a common parent. You'll understand in a second what I mean. So here, have you seen selectors like this before in CSS? Who wants to leave at this point? That's okay. Okay. Nobody wants to leave, nobody wants to stay. You're like Schrödinger's cat all over again. It's very hard for me. So if you experience a selector like this, what happens is this. So the browser is going to check for all LIs, but it's going to read it, the selector, from right to left. So it's going to check, OK, I need to find all LIs that are first child. So they find one, this one, and it's going to match only if it's also 6, starting counting from the last one. All right? So this matches because it's first child, but it's also the 6th from the last one. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so it matches. But we don't want just to match one if it's 6, exactly 6. We want it to be kind of starting counting from left to right. So we want to say, if it's at least 6, we want it to look this way. If it's at most 6, we want it to look the other way. So what we can say then, we're going to target that one, the first child, and also all the adjacent or kind of sibling selectors of that element. In that case, we're just looking to the first one, which happens to be the 6th from the last one, which is this one, and then we're going to target all the other ones as well, coming after it. This is what the adjacent selector is for. And we also might want to have something like this, right? Where we can say, if I have at least 6, I want the 6th to the 9th or so to be started in a specific way. And this is also where we can apply color and font size and whatever we want, without media queries at all. Right? And so what we can do as well is say, OK, so we have these ranges that we can define. Remember that problem we had in the beginning? The first 5 images, if we can display them in one line, they're going to look big. The other ones are going to be smaller, 10, and then the other ones are going to be very, very small. So we can use exactly this technique to make it work. And browser support, yes, it's always the same story. It's always Internet Explorer 8. That's a big deal. Internet Explorer 9 is kind of OK with it. So browser support, great. So if we want to create that perfect grid, what we end up having is we need to define layout for any number of items within specific quantity selectors. So what we do is this. We use a mod query selector. I promised you math. Here we go. So we need to say, if I have anything, a list of items divisible by 3, I want to style it this way. Divisible by 5, I want to style it this way. Now, you can go through prime numbers and go all the way until 23 or whatever, but usually it's not going to be required, I guess. So you can just go from, let's say, 2, 3, 5, 7, and you're done. And you define the beautiful experience, responsive experience, without media queries at all. And it's going to work if it's 5 items, or 15 items, or 55 items. Right? At some point, you might need to have a pagination, of course, at the bottom, so the users can navigate through this rest of the items. But you define it once, and it's going to work all the time. So what happens here is we select all following siblings, which fall after the first child, which is also divisible by 3, starting from the end. And I know it sounds daunting and weird and math-heavy, but of course you don't have to build something like this manually, because there are tools. But it's really important to understand the power that this technique comes with. There is a lot of stuff you can do with it. Because you can also take it to the next level and say, I don't want to just have the first 5 items start in a specific way. I want also the 6th to 16th to be started in a different way. And this is where range selector comes into place. We can play with nth child with a negative value and a positive value in order to start specifically a range of items, right? So you end up creating this in basically 5 lines of CSS. Yeah, creepy CSS, but it's basically 5 lines of CSS. Because what you need to do is you need a mode query, and you also need a range selector. And that's it. And you define it only once. So you end up with something like this. And that's it. And this is how you can make it work. And of course, there are tools. So you can go ahead and use this tool, the one I showed before, in order to create those styles or those selectors easily. So here we go. Okay, just a second. I need to jump a little bit because I'm running out of time. And the last one. So, pretty much every single thing I showed so far is responsive, and it doesn't contain media queries. Or it doesn't have to contain media queries. You can adjust the experience if you want to, but you can also get away with it without it. So what about a very common problem that actually happens to be everywhere? What if you want to use a full-width element in a fixed-width container? For example, when you want some content to extend beyond the boundaries of the container, something like this. Probably will be familiar with this. So we have this box, this container, where we have our articles, product descriptions, whatever it is. And then we want that image to be kind of extending beyond the boundaries of that container. Now, it's a very simple problem to solve, and you could say, well, what's the big deal? So we have this container, right? And it has a max width, so it doesn't, the text doesn't flow infinitely. And the only thing we need to do is close it and then add an image and then reopen it again. But this is so sad and boring, and that's not cool, right? It's like, yeah, this is the last method of resort. If you're desperate and you want to go home and drink, this is probably the way to go, right? But this is probably not what we want. We want it to be, resilient. So how can we make this work? We want to release the child element outside of the scope of the container in which it's placed, without breaking things and without any media queries and without breaking the code. Imagine it living in a CMS somewhere, right? Do you want somebody to reopen and close containers all the time? You just want to give that element, that image, or that code snippet, or whatever you want to have there, a class name, and here you go, it should be done. So we need to use a little bit of math here again, but we don't have to, as we will see in a second. We can use calc to make it work. Because if we need to think about what is the space that we need to pull out that image from that container, right? Now, we know that percentage within the container refers to the width of the container. And then, of course, we also have VW and VH units that refer to the viewport. So what we could say is, well, we have that image with this class uRelease, for example. We're going to set margin left as a calc of minus 50 VW plus 50%. Why the hell would we do that? Well, because 50% refers to exactly the 50% of the container. 50 VW refers to 50% of the actual viewport width. And if we remove from that container that space, 50 VW, we end up with exactly, this space, that 50 VW, we end up with exactly that space that we need to push the image on the left and on the right in order for it to extend the entire space. Does it make sense? Right? So it's not a big deal. But whenever you're using VH or VW, you might end up with this beautiful thing, the beast, the scroll bar. And it's super annoying. And the reason why is basically because if you look at the spec, which is a fantastic reading material to read on Sunday evening, you'll find out that the viewport, the width of a scroll bar or the height of the scroll bar does not account if you're actually talking about VH or VW. So one fix, a dirty fix, horrible fix to make it work, is of course to just set overflow X hidden, but that's not cool. We don't want that. That's not beautiful. It's even worse than actually closing and reopening the container again. So what else can we do? Well, we don't have to use calc, because we could say, I'm going to do the same mathematical expression, but then with left and right, and margin left and margin right, right? And then you're done. which is really cool. But then you can also take it to the next level, where you could say, actually, if we want to think about what we need to achieve, and this is where we have to think a bit more beyond the scope of what we're used to, well, we kind of want to have this, right? So we have, let's say, a container. In that container, we have the content area and the image. We want the image to expand. But what if we turn it around and we do it slightly differently? What if we use CSS grid layout for this? We could say, well, let's put CSS grid layout on the container, display grid, and let's create a 3-column grid. So we could have one column, second column, third column over here. As we'll see in a second, this is what it's going to look like. And can give each of these lines a name. And this happens in brackets in CSS grid layout. So you can say full start, full end. This is the main container that we're putting everything in. And then inside of that container, we're going to have a main content area, which starts right here and starts right here. And this thing is supposed to grow beautifully from 1 em to 1 fraction unit, which, if you know Flexbox, is like flex grow 1, actually. And here, the same thing is happening on the left side as well. So you end up with this, defining your template columns. So you have basically a simple CSS grid layout with 3 columns in it. And this one grows from 1 em to 1 fraction unit, just like this one. And this one is a bit bigger, because it has to be a bit bigger. And then you do exactly the same thing like we had in the previous example, just a little bit different, because you can say, I want everything living inside of the container, the content area, right, to be flowing into the main area, which is exactly this one, which is defined by main start and main end over here. Right? This is like start and end are keywords, while main is like prefix or so that you can use to target specific styles. And then if you want to release that thing, that image or whatever you want to have, well, you can say, well, I want the grid column to full, meaning it's going to kind of flow into the entire space that we have from full start to full end. While this one is going to live only between main start and main end. And so you end up creating this with 3 lines of CSS. And you can take it to the next level, because if you think about it, that's really, really helpful. Because if you have a container living inside of another container, like I say with a sidebar, right, it's still going to work. Well, if you count it, like if you make it work only with viewport units, viewport width, viewport height, it's not going to work if you put it inside of a box like this. And you can also create some stuff like this easily, and even create some interesting layouts like this without any extra work. The only thing to keep in mind here is if you do use CSS grid, you can't float immediate children of an element with display grid. Plus, you also need, of course, to use some sort of fallback for browsers not supporting it. So you'll have to use some of these previous techniques to make it work still. And there is a very nice article about this too. And you might be wondering, so seriously, who is using CSS grid layout? Well, the browser support at this point is in Firefox and in Chrome and in Opera and in Chrome for Android. And it's actually also well supported in not Internet Explorer. In Internet 11, because it's coming from Microsoft, and of course in Edge. So at this point, it's more than 45% of browsers supporting it actively, consistently, unlike with Flexbox. So no reason not to use it. Now, I'll be sharing lots of other stuff in the workshop today, but I hope that at least some of this stuff was quite useful. And the main point I want to deliver is, when we think about responsive design, we tend to focus most of the time on playing with media queries and adjusting things more or less back and forth. But this is not what it's all about. It's all about creating those experiences that actually are fluid enough to support you in your work long time in terms of maintenance, because maintenance is often the bottleneck. So with this in mind, thank you for your attention.